Libya, Bahrain, and protest. Nearly 9 in 10 Egyptians and Tunisians surveyed said that they were using Facebook or Twitter. And a further 28% said that without these technologies, their communication would have been hindered or disrupted. So, in a similar vein, when the Occupy movement protests against our democracy, being transformed into a corporation, essentially, conventional news sources basically have a conflict of interest in transmitting an accurate picture of what is actually going on the ground. So, and not only this, the physical camps that that the Occupy movement occupied get constantly, continually physically broken, and therefore the virtual identity and the virtual network becomes key into the movement and to ensure that it's sustained. And a considerable amount of attention has been focused on social media and digital technologies for collective activism and this concept of a digital democracy. Now, I think while digital platforms allow activists to freely communicate, it is quite ironic because the internet is increasingly run by a handful of corporate entities. So this is the dialogue that we are interested in exploring. And of course, if we're going to have conversations about digital self, it's important to realize that this is not an old concept. This is not a new concept. And that public relations or propaganda, depending on which side of the fence you stand on, are not new. And indeed, the concept of a web and a network has been around since the 19th century. So that's the first theme of the studio. And the second theme
is case experience. And I think what we're interested in within the studio, what will be kind of beginning to distinguish us from other studios or other opportunities, is how you bring in experts into your project to help develop what the brief is going to be and what your case study. We're going to be providing framework, like early on we'll have a workshop with a group called mensch.org, who are going to kind of help us be facilitators to work with not individual communities, but actually activist organizations such as Greenpeace or Save the Children, so that in pairs of 2, you will begin to understand how they're dealing with new forms of organization, new forms of communication, to deal with climate change, to deal with the refugee issue, to deal with migration, or to deal with other forms of a digital identity, which would be home-based in the UK, that have nothing to do with kind of the humanitarian sector. Say another area that we're interested in is the Wainwrights walk over the northern part of England. What would a digital identity of that project begin to look at? So we've talked about a number of different ways that this will go on. So instead of reading books and reading text and reading research, we want you to be fully engaged with meeting people and beginning to kind of network yourself towards a global ambition. So we're looking more towards activist practices, not just working with local communities.
So those first 2 themes are set the context in terms of what our interests are, and the second 2 parts of the studio structure are sort of relating to how we might get there. So we're going to look at documentary photography techniques and the difference between journalistic techniques and as opposed to documentary. And we're going to really sort of break down how these images can construct a powerful narrative. So we will be working with Clive. We will be working with Clive. And also Martina. Yeah. And so the final theme that we are will be exploring is drawing as epistemic practice, and the other way I like to think about it is rendering knowledge. So, of course, we're all familiar with Jimmy's Manhattan transcripts and the idea that the drawing can convey more than just mere representation. This is an old idea in architecture and a way of thinking, which is something that we highly encourage students to do. I'm going to just show a student project that really sort of took this on board, which is Isaac, who I taught last year. This is a second-year project, and Isaac was interested in body calligraphy. That was Japanese calligraphy, and he was interested in how this could inform the spaces of his building. And the way that he really got through this process was he first built a device which was scanning the body and then reinterpreting that as a digital drawing. But then he would draw the process in which he would redraw his design process itself as a way of communicating his thought process. And it meant when he got to his final project, the thinking behind his conceptual drawings directly informed his building in a very, very deep way, to the point, and his building, it's very subtle but very sophisticated in the way that you move through the spaces, in that you crouch down to access certain areas, you step up into certain levels, you have to take off your shoes to experience certain textures of the building. And for a second-year bachelor project, that process of using drawings as a thinking tool, not just a means of end representation, really helped develop a project of this sophistication. And we got his, he ended up winning the drawing prize at the Bartlett, which is unusual, very unusual for a second year.
This is a project out of a Part 2 student 2 years ago, Nicole Ludwig, who was looking at the notion of isolation and memory. So she did a series of collages that eventually led to a mapping exercise, and also kind of came up with a new scheme for City Airport that was no longer about people just moving through, but actually almost as a form of contemplation. So the projects can be very conventional type program briefs, but all have a civic understanding of notion of identity and memory. And this is one of her kind of, I'll say, a form of documentary photography, which became very visible through the way she began to look at landscape, and also to begin to kind of have this frontal understanding of organization of a space. This is a composed drawing. It is not something that she photoshopped. And also kind of her position about Paris in terms of creating a strong civic boundary in order for some of the issues around immigration and migration could be contained and developed. This is Ashish Rometta, who also was looking at similar ideas about human rights 2 years ago, and this is a kind of a center for to record death, and also a crematorium that was done in West London. And this is David Morgan, who used his whole portfolio was a series of films. He didn't really do drawings as part of his project. And his ambition was to really look at, this was an archive for Stanley Kubrick, but it was designed through Alfred Hitchcock. So what it began to introduce is new conditions for environmental sustainability space that are not based upon trying to keep light out or trying to kind of begin to organize, certain types of exterior wall performance, but it was really about the awareness of the experience and the atmosphere of the space. And so he did a series of films. These are actual maquettes that are about this big, where he would find a piece of furniture to give it a sense of scale, and then build the scale of the room around it, and then begin to look at lighting from a cinematographic, from a film standpoint, and begin to kind of have these changes in awareness of the space as you move through the duration of the day.
This is Jack Leather's project from Unit 9 last year, and Jack was, so he visited Japan, so all these themes are Japanese focused. But he was fascinated by the Japanese take on disasters and earthquakes, and how they were completely quite casual when an earthquake happened. They would go through the routines of an emergency, but they wouldn't panic like we would possibly do over here in the West. But so Jack was really interested in this creative expression of the weather and of a weather disaster. So he made these little devices which are feeding into weather data and creating little storms in these little frames. And so they were sort of emulating tsunamis and earthquakes and then so that was his first project. And then for his final project, he built a center of natural disasters, and the scenes, the rooms in the buildings would be trying to evoke these particular disaster scenes. So he had like the earthquake room, the tsunami room, and the lightning room, and again a second-year bachelor project. And then Sophie's project, again from Unit 9. Sophie was interested in, so Sophie's narrative begins from an observation that as the climate warms, the cherry trees in Tokyo's parks can no longer blossom, and therefore the big celebration that happens every year when the cherry blossoms bloom becomes a distant memory which future generations can't experience. So she creates this digital park which maps the existing locations of the trees as they are currently, and then creates these digital trees and this digital park which can only be experienced at night and through these technological standpoints. And
That's it? And we're just on time?